Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories. The city was ordinary, with its everyday worries, the noise of cars, and the thousands of people who went to work every day hardly noticing each other. But sometimes in such ordinary places, the most terrifying secrets hide. The story I'm about to tell began with a simple ad on Craigslist. Mark had always dreamed of his own house. Small, cozy, where he could live away from the noise of the city. His apartment in the center had long turned into a cage, and his office job drained all his energy. So, when he saw an ad for a house for sale at a ridiculously low price, his heart started to race. Old house for sale. Isolated, quiet, perfect for those seeking peace. Price, $50,000. Contact the owner. The photos were of poor quality, but Mark could make out a wooden house in the Victorian style, surrounded by dense forest. There was something about this place that attracted him, even though it looked a bit gloomy. He immediately sent a message. The reply came quickly. The owner, who introduced himself as Mr. Graves, suggested meeting at the location. "The house needs a new owner," he wrote. "But I warn you, it's special." Mark didn't give it much thought. He was ready to do anything to escape his dull reality. The drive to the house took a few hours. The forest surrounding the property was so dense that the sun barely filtered through the branches. The air was cold even though it was summer. When Mark arrived at the house, he felt a strange sorrow. The house looked old but not ruined. The windows were intact, the doors were closed, and on the porch stood Mr. Graves, a tall, thin man in a dark suit, with a face that resembled a mask. "You've arrived," he said without smiling. "Come in." The interior of the house was unexpectedly beautiful. Antique furniture, wooden floors, a fireplace in the living room. Everything looked as if time had bypassed this place. But there was something else. Something Mark couldn't explain. A vibration in the air, as if the house was alive and watching him. "Why such a low price?" Mark asked as they discussed the terms. Mr. Graves froze for a moment, then said, "This house. It needs a special owner. Someone who will understand it." Mark didn't understand what that meant, but he was already captivated by the idea of owning his own home. He signed the papers, and Mr. Graves disappeared as quietly as he had appeared. The first few days in the house were peaceful. Mark enjoyed the silence and space. But then, strange things started happening. At night, he would hear footsteps on the second floor, even though he knew no one else was in the house. The doors would open and close by themselves, and shadows would appear in the hallways, moving as if someone were walking nearby. One time he woke up to find someone standing by his bed. He even felt cold breath on his face, but when he turned on the light, no one was there. Mark began searching for information about the house. He learned that previous owners had disappeared without a trace. One of them had even left a diary found in the basement. On the last page it was written, "He doesn't want me to leave. He wants me to stay forever." One night, Mark decided to go down to the basement. He had never been there before, but something was pulling him downstairs. The basement was cold and damp, and there was a smell of decay in the air. On the wall, he saw strange symbols painted in black paint. They looked ancient, even sinister. When he turned to go back upstairs, the basement door slammed shut. He tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly he heard a voice. Quiet, whispering but clear. "You're mine now." Mark turned and saw a shadow moving toward him. It had no shape, but he felt that it was watching him. He screamed, but no one could hear him. The next morning, the basement door was open. Mark managed to get out, but he knew something had changed. The house was no longer just a building. It was alive. And it didn't want Mark to leave. From that day on, Mark began hearing voices. They whispered in his head, telling him about the house's past, about the people who had lived there before. They said he was now part of this place. Forever. Mark tried to sell the house. He posted an ad on Craigslist, but every time someone came to see it, they quickly left, looking frightened. One time he saw one of the potential buyers running to his car, shouting, "It's alive! It's alive!" Now, Mark sits in the living room staring at the fireplace. He knows he will never leave. The house won't let him. And every time he hears footsteps on the second floor, he understands that they aren't shadows. They're the previous owners. They tried to escape too. But the house always wins. Mark sat in the living room staring at the flames in the fireplace. He tried to gather his thoughts, but the voices in his head wouldn't quiet down. They whispered to him about the house's past, about the people who had lived there before. He even began to make out individual words. Don't go. You're ours. Stay. He knew he couldn't keep going like this. His mind was slowly breaking down, and he realized that if he didn't find a way out, he would become the next in a long line of missing owners. The search for the truth. Mark decided to take action. He began by going down to the basement again. This time he brought a flashlight and a camera. He wanted to capture everything he saw, even if it was something terrifying. The basement was the same as before, cold, damp, with strange symbols on the walls. He examined them carefully and took several photos. Then he noticed something he hadn't seen before. In the corner lay an old chest covered in dust. Opening it, Mark found the diaries of previous owners. They were filled with entries about how the house gradually took over their lives. One entry in particular caught his attention. I learned that the house was built in 1890 by a man named Elias Graves. He was a recluse who practiced occultism. They say he brought something sinister into the house. Something that cannot be destroyed. Mark realized that Mr. Graves, who sold him the house, was a descendant of Elias. He decided to find him. Meeting Mr. Graves, Mark found Mr. Graves' address in old documents. It led to a small town a few hours away from the house. When he arrived, he discovered that Mr. Graves lived in an old house similar to the one Mark had bought. He knocked on the door, and after a few minutes, the same tall, thin man appeared. I knew you would come, Mr. Graves said, not looking surprised. Come in. Mark told him everything that had happened. The footsteps, the shadows, the voices. Mr. Graves listened carefully, then said, You're not the first to come to me with this. But you're the first who wants to fight. What can I do? Mark asked. Mr. Graves offered him a seat and told the story of his ancestor. Elias Graves was an occultist who believed he could contact the supernatural world. He performed a ritual in the house to summon a guardian, a creature that was supposed to protect his family. But something went wrong. The creature got out of control and attached itself to the house, consuming anyone who tried to become its master. The only way to be free is to complete the ritual, Mr. Graves said. But it's dangerous. If you make a mistake, the creature will become stronger. Mark agreed. He knew this was his only chance. The ritual. Mr. Graves gave Mark instructions. He needed to find 5 items in the house that belonged to Elias. An old knife, a spellbook, a ring with a seal, a candle made of black wax, and a stone with strange symbols. They were hidden in different corners of the house. Mark spent several days searching for the items. Each time he found one, the voices in his head grew louder. They screamed for him to stop, but he continued. Finally, when all the items were gathered, Mark went to the basement. He placed the candle in the center of the room, opened the spellbook, and began reading the words written on the last page. The air around him became thick and the candlelight flickered. Suddenly he heard a voice much louder than all the others. You have no right to free me. Mark kept reading, even as the shadows around him began to move, forming a figure that resembled a person. He felt a coldness that pierced his bones, but he didn't stop. When he finished, the shadow hung in the air before dissipating. The air became clearer and the voices in his head disappeared. After Mark came out of the basement feeling free. He knew the house no longer had power over him. But he also knew the creature hadn't vanished forever. It had merely fallen asleep, waiting for the next owner. Mark decided to destroy the house. He knew that was the only way to prevent new victims. When the house burned down, he felt something heavy lift off his shoulders. They whispered to him, You won't escape forever. Mark stood on the ruins where the house once stood. The wind scattered the ashes as he looked at what remained of his dream of a peaceful life. He felt relieved, but deep inside, something troubled him. The entity he had freed was destroyed, but had it truly disappeared forever? A few weeks after the house was destroyed, Mark returned to the city. He tried to live a normal life, but the nightmares wouldn't let him rest. He kept having the same dream. He was standing in the basement, surrounded by shifting shadows. They whispered, You will never escape forever. One day he received a package. There was no return address. Inside he found the old spellbook he had used for the ritual. On the first page a message was written, "Did you think it was over? This is only the beginning." Mark realized that the entity had not vanished. It had simply found a new way to return. Mark decided to seek out Mr. Graves. He knew he was the only one who could help. When he arrived at Mr. Graves' house, he found it abandoned. On the table lay a note, "I knew you would come back. The entity is stronger than we thought. The only way to stop it is to destroy the source of its power. Find Elias' ring. It is in the house." Mark realized the note referred to the signet ring he had found during the ritual. He returned to the ruins and began digging through the ashes. After hours of searching, he found the ring. It was hot to the touch, almost as if it were alive. Mark understood that the only way to stop the entity was to destroy the ring. He returned to the site where the house once stood and built a fire. When he threw the ring into the flames, the air around him thickened, and the wind twisted into a vortex. A scream pierced through the night, splitting his ears. "No! You cannot!" The ring melted and the scream faded. The wind calmed and silence fell. Mark felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew this was truly the end. Mark returned to the city and tried to live a normal life. He knew the entity no longer threatened him, but he also knew that some secrets were better left buried. He never bought an old house again and never even looked at Craigslist listings. But sometimes when he closed his eyes he saw the shadows. They were distant, barely visible, but they were there. And he knew they would never fully disappear. Jake Reynolds had spent months looking for a house. Prices were high, and everything decent was either overpriced or in terrible condition. So when he found a 3-bedroom home listed on Craigslist for almost half the market price, it felt like a miracle. The ad was simple. 3BD 2BA house in quiet neighborhood. Recently renovated. $110,000. Need to sell fast. Call for details. The photos showed a charming older home with a fresh coat of paint, hardwood floors, and a large backyard. It was exactly what Jake wanted. He called the number immediately. A man named Tom answered. His voice was calm but somewhat distant, like he wasn't used to talking much. "It's still available," Tom said. "If you're interested, I can show it to you tonight." Jake hesitated. A nighttime showing wasn't ideal, but with a deal this good, someone else could grab it before he did. "Sure. I'll be there at 8. The house was on the edge of town in a quiet, wooded area. It was older than it looked in the pictures but well maintained. The porch light was on when Jake arrived, but the house itself felt strangely dark. Tom, a thin man in his late 50s, greeted him at the door. His handshake was firm, but his eyes darted around like he was nervous. Jake stepped inside. The house had a faint smell, something like wood and dust, but with a hint of something else. Something almost metallic. The rooms were spacious. The hardwood floors creaked underfoot. "You said it was recently renovated?" Jake asked. Tom nodded. "Yeah, mostly cosmetic. Fresh paint, new fixtures. House has good bones." Jake noticed something odd. The light switches were all brand new, but the walls around them had small scratches, like someone had dug into the drywall with their nails. He let it slide. They walked into the basement, where Tom hesitated before turning on the light. The room was empty, except for a large wooden cabinet against the far wall. "What's in there?" Jake asked. Tom forced a smile. "Just some old stuff. It stays with the house." Jake opened the cabinet. Inside was an old rotary phone, disconnected, but clean like someone had recently wiped it down. Weird. But not a deal breaker. Jake signed the paperwork the next day. The price was unbeatable, and despite the weird little details, he couldn't pass it up. The first night he moved in with just a mattress, a chair, and a few boxes. The house felt empty but in a peaceful way. Then at 3:13 a.m. the phone rang. Jake shot up in bed. It wasn't his cell. It was coming from downstairs. The rotary phone in the basement. He hadn't even plugged it in. His heart pounded as he crept downstairs. The ringing continued, sharp and unnatural in the silence of the house. He hesitated, then picked it up. Nothing. Just static. Then a whisper. "Don't open the cabinet." Jake slammed the phone down. His breath came fast. His skin felt cold. It was a prank. It had to be. Right? The next day Jake pulled the cabinet away from the wall. Behind it the drywall was rotting. The wood was dark, damp, and covered